For 3 long decades, this incredibly fastidious man was trapped in a truly horrifying professional nightmare, forced to sit day in and day out within. Uncomfortable, intimate proximity to some of Hollywood's most hygienically challenged personalities, breathing in their recycled air, sharing their personal space, and somehow maintaining his composed, unflappable demeanor, while enduring sensory assaults that would have sent most ordinary people running screaming from the building. What follows are the unfiltered true stories that high-level NBC executives hoped would never see the light of day. The absolutely revolting behind-the-scenes reality of what the legendary Johnny Carson actually endured in the name of late-night entertainment. These aren't just your standard amusing talk show anecdotes or charming little bloopers. They are shocking revelations about what really went down when the cameras stopped rolling and the smell became too overwhelming for even television's greatest professional to stomach. That is right. I do not handle it well. You and Ed, really, you do not. I do not handle alcohol well at all. No, I really do not. Chapter 6. The Heavy Smoker Era, a Toxic Cloud of Celebrity Stench. Before we dive into the specific individual offenders, we must first acknowledge the nauseating baseline conditions that Carson was forced to endure throughout the first 2 decades of his tenure. Today's sterile antiseptic television. Studios bear absolutely no resemblance to the toxic, smog-filled environment of 1960s and 1970s, broadcasting a literal fog of carcinogenic chemicals that created what longtime crew members dubbed celebrity soup. The studio was not just a little bit smoky, it was practically a chimney. It was a hazardous environment that would flagrantly violate every single workplace safety standard known today, as revealed by former NBC page Thomas Wilson. Celebrities would chain smoke aggressively through their pre-interviews, continue puffing away during their segments, and leave behind a revolting sticky film of nicotine that coated every single surface. The situation was made exponentially worse by the specific celebrities who combined their heavy tobacco habits with other incredibly pungent personal signatures. Bette Davis, a frequent and legendary guest, created what the crew members secretly referred to as the Davis Cloud, a noxious, eye-watering combination of her trademark cigarette smoke, heavy floral perfume, and bourbon-soaked breath that literally altered the air quality of the studio. After Davis appeared on stage, we had to drag in industrial-sized fans between tapings just to clear the air, confessed set decorator Marion Lewis. Her particular aroma would linger so persistently in the fabric that guests scheduled after her would sometimes sniff the air and ask, "Did Bette Davis just live?" without even being told she had been there that evening. It was as if her olfactory ghost haunted the furniture long after she was gone. Dean Martin elevated the challenge to truly shocking levels when he appeared combining his cigarettes with his infamous alcohol consumption. What the viewers at home never saw was the disturbing reality that by the time Martin actually reached the couch, he had often already consumed so much liquor that his pores were actively expelling the toxins into the air around him. Sitting next to Dean was like being hit in the face with a physical wave of distillery fumes. Carson once confided to his producer after a particularly pungent appearance by Martin, noting that it was not just bad breath. It was oozing through his skin. I could literally taste it in my mouth while I was trying to interview him. The physical toll this took on the fastidious host was visible only to those who knew him best. Makeup artist Teresa Williams recalled the alarming post-segment ritual Johnny performed. Johnny would immediately retreat to his dressing room where he kept a stash of special strength mouthwash. He said he could taste their cigarettes on his tongue even though he had not smoked himself. He would gargle so aggressively that I worried he might actually damage his vocal cords. The situation reached such extreme vomit-inducing levels during a 1974 appearance by actor George Segal that a truly disturbing behind-the-scenes incident occurred. Segal, a notoriously heavy smoker, had been puffing away so continuously that during a commercial break, Carson was seen discreetly vomiting into a wastebasket, completely overcome by the concentration of smoke in his immediate vicinity. Johnny never complained on air, never emphasized former NBC executive Frank Milton. But that night, he told the executive producer that either Segal needed to stop smoking right now, or Johnny was walking off the set. It was the only time I ever saw him make that kind of serious ultimatum in all his years. What viewers at home never realized was that Carson's famous water sips were not just for lubricating his throat. They were a desperate functional attempt to combat the drying effect of sitting in what amounted to a smoke sauna for 90 minutes each night. His documentary-worthy poker face hid the revolting reality that beneath the desk, Carson's knuckles, would often turn white as he gripped the arms of his chair, fighting the physical urge to flee from the toxic cloud enveloping him. Did you hear the one about the woman who goes to the dentist? She says, "I have to have a tooth out." Yeah. And he looks in her mouth. He says that tooth will have to come out. Buddy Hackett, the human sprinkler system. Comedy legend Buddy Hackett made over 100 appearances on The Tonight Show, delighting audiences with his rubber-faced humor and outrageous stories. But the disturbing truth behind these seemingly jovial interviews would have absolutely horrified viewers had they known what Johnny was really enduring in the splash zone. Hackett struggled with a rather unfortunate medical quirk, a severe case of excessive drooling paired with a total inability to understand personal boundaries. The combination created a nightmare scenario that the Tonight Show crew secretly dubbed the Splash Zone, a literal radius of dampness surrounding Hackett by the time his segments wrapped up. We aren't talking about the occasional stray droplet here or there. It wasn't just spittle, it was a relentless fine mist that got heavier the more excited he got spilled former cue card holder Martin Jenkins. Basically, the 3 feet surrounding Buddy turned into a fog bank. Johnny would come back from a commercial break and his impeccably tailored suit jacket would be speckled with actual moisture spots. To put it bluntly, it was absolutely revolting. Carson, who was famously terrified of germs and bodily fluids, actually had to engineer specific survival tactics for Hackett's interviews that only the most eagle-eyed fans would ever catch. He perfected a maneuver the staff called the Hackett lean, a deceptive posture where he leaned back as far as physically possible while still looking interested just to maximize the safety gap. But the real bombshell was the discovery that Johnny wore a specially chemically treated suit whenever Hackett was booked on the show. The wardrobe department actually sprayed a clear water-repellent sealant onto Johnny's jacket, on Hackett days admitted Carson's personal dresser, Harold Ming. It was literally the same heavy-duty chemical treatment used to waterproof trench coats, just tweaked slightly so it wouldn't look shiny under the studio lights. Johnny demanded this extreme measure after a disastrous 1968 interview where Hackett's storytelling projected visible droplets onto Johnny's sleeve droplets the cameras actually captured. The absolute nadir of these encounters happened during a 1975 taping when Hackett got wildly animated telling a story about Las Vegas. In a fit of enthusiasm, he unknowingly launched what one traumatized camera operator could only describe as a torrential downpour. This wasn't a mist, it was a direct hit that splattered Johnny square in the face. While the audience at home saw Carson throw his head back in seemingly uproarious laughter, he was actually using the motion to frantically wipe the saliva out of his eyes before the camera cut back to him. Following that catastrophe, Johnny insisted on having a full, fresh change of clothing prepped and waiting in his dressing room, according to production assistant Kevin Bartley. The second the "we're clear" signal was given, he would sprint off stage, strip everything off, and take a full shower before he could even think about greeting the next guest. The man was genuinely shaken to his core by the filth of it all. What truly boggles the mind is that despite enduring this biological warfare, Carson kept booking Hackett over and over again. It went way beyond simple professionalism. It showed that Carson understood that ratings gold sometimes demanded literal physical sacrifice. He once grimly cracked a joke to Ed McMahon after a particularly soggy session, muttering, "I honestly deserve a Purple Heart and hazard pay for sitting through that." Behind the scenes, the crew had to invent complex protocols to deal with what they politely termed the Hackett aftermath. This protocol included a dedicated Hackett towel, a rag used exclusively to mop down the host's desk and chair the moment the comedian stood up. But the grossest detail has to be the fact that the upholstery on that iconic Tonight Show couch wasn't safe either. Maintenance had to completely reupholster the furniture after a run of 3 Hackett appearances in 1 month because the fluid actually ate through the fabric's protective water-resistant layer. Penny Singleton is a nickel double. It's all going nickels. Pump a dime, pick one. I'm in serious trouble up here. Then there was Rip Taylor the Human Geyser. Famous as the king of confetti for throwing paper everywhere, Taylor brought a chaotic, manic energy to every set he walked onto. However, his 1977 stop at The Tonight Show went down in history among the staff for reasons so stomach-churning that the network suits tried to bury the footage for decades. It became the stuff of backstage legend for reasons so vile that executives tried to keep a lid on the story for years. Taylor showed up at the Burbank studio already displaying symptoms of what the official logs diplomatically described as excessive perspiration. The truth, according to everyone present that day, was infinitely more disturbing than a little sweat. It looked like Taylor was actively melting, likely under the influence of what many whispered were some incredibly potent pharmaceutical stimulants. "In 40 years of working television, I have never witnessed anything like it," said lighting director Samuel Peterson. The man wasn't just sweating, he was literally leaking. It was as though his pores were violently ejecting every drop of water in his body. By the time he flopped onto the couch, a slick, shiny film covered every inch of his exposed skin. Carson's internal reaction, while masked from the home audience, was meticulously noted in several private staff diaries. When Taylor went in for the handshake, Johnny visibly froze for a split second before committing to the touch, a micro-hesitation that screamed panic to anyone who knew about his phobias. That tiny pause spoke volumes about the sheer terror he felt regarding the contamination coming his way. What the broadcast cameras carefully avoided showing was Carson discreetly wiping his palm on the underside of his desk the instant the greeting was over. Johnny's hand came back up literally dripping wet, revealed floor director Thomas Allen. The expression in his eyes was pure, unadulterated horror, but he snapped back to TV host mode instantly. His self-control was practically superhuman. As the interview dragged on, the hygiene situation spiraled into a truly nightmarish scenario. Under those blazing studio lights, Taylor's sweat output ramped up to levels that actually endangered the sensitive microphones and electronic gear. His polyester shirt got so waterlogged that viewers could watch it change color in real-time, morphing from a light powder blue to a deep navy as it soaked up an impossible volume of perspiration. The absolute peak of this broadcast disaster hit during a wildly energetic anecdote right when Taylor suddenly jumped out of his seat to act out a chaotic bit of physical comedy. That abrupt motion unleashed what a cameraman later detailed in his tell-all book as a genuine spray pattern catching the studio lights and glistening briefly in the air, exactly like a triggered sprinkler system. Visible droplets actually rained down directly onto Johnny Carson's pristine desk surface, sparking a scenario so visually unsettling that sidekick Ed McMahon eventually confessed he almost completely lost his composure during the live broadcast. Johnny's features instantly locked into what the crew dubbed his crisis mask, that specific rigid expression he adopted whenever a segment was going spectacularly off the rails, but he was forced to ignore it, as producer Michael Sloan vividly remembered. His eyes glazed over with that classic 1,000-yard stare, all while his trademark smile remained plastered on his face like a permanent fixture. It was essentially the look of a man suffering through deep internal trauma while desperately maintaining the charade that everything was perfectly fine. The true magnitude of this horror show only came to light once they cut to a commercial break, shielding the home viewers from the absolute chaos erupting on the set. Carson instantly signaled for his personal assistant, who sprinted toward the desk armed with a key, towel, and a bottle of hand sanitizer products that were definitely not standard issue back in the 1970s, but items Carson demanded be kept within arm's reach at all times. The guest chair was practically swimming in moisture, forcing production assistants to furiously blot the upholstery with towels before they could even think about seating the next celebrity. Perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire ordeal was the realization that Taylor appeared to be totally oblivious to the mess he was creating. When a helpful makeup artist tried to step in during the break with blotting papers, Taylor just waved them off with a cheerful refusal, quipping, "Honey, this is just how I sparkle, don't you know?" Immediately following this catastrophic appearance, Carson put into effect what the backstage staff referred to as the Taylor Protocol, a strict set of defensive guidelines to be triggered whenever they booked guests known for similar perspiration issues. These precautions involved slipping a discreet plastic liner onto the guest's seat and actually shifting Carson's position an extra 6 inches further away from the guest chair than usual, along with keeping a fresh set of clothes on standby for any sudden wardrobe emergencies. Unsurprisingly, Taylor's appearances on The Tonight Show dropped off significantly after that wet disaster, although Carson never uttered a single public word explaining why. It wasn't until years down the line that a former NBC executive finally spilled the beans and confirmed the shocking reality behind the ban. Johnny had explicitly instructed the talent bookers, saying, "I don't mind funny, but I simply cannot handle drowning on my own talk show." Now, as many of you know, sherry, or sack, is traditionally fortified with brandy. It is incredibly potent stuff. Number 3. Orson Welles, the man they called the human hothouse. By the time Orson Welles settled in as a regular fixture on The Tonight Show during the 1970s, the once dashing visionary director of Citizen Kane had morphed into a massive physical presence. While his cinematic genius was untouched, his body had ballooned to dimensions that were genuinely shocking to behold. This physical transformation created a hygiene crisis so severe that it necessitated specialized backstage protocols unlike anything else ever seen in the program's long history. Welles, who towered at 6 feet 1 inch and tipped the scales at well over 300 pounds during his final years, generated what the camera crew whispered about as the Orson effect, a localized atmospheric shift that kicked in within minutes of him settling under those hot studio lights. The potent combination of his enormous frame, his insistence on wearing multiple layers of dark clothing in an attempt to hide his bulk, and the searing heat of the stage lights created a perfect storm of sweat that absolutely horrified the fastidious Carson. The heat radiating off him was actually measurable, claimed former set technician Harold Barnes in a later interview. We literally recorded a 7-degree temperature spike in his immediate vicinity. It was akin to sitting right next to a human furnace, and the resulting impact on his personal scent was exactly as unpleasant as you might imagine. This delicate situation was made exponentially worse by Welles's severe mobility struggles, which made quick trips backstage to freshen up during commercials impossible. Instead, the production crew had to engineer an elaborate system that official documents politely termed cooling the Orson, but which the staff more bluntly referred to as sweat crisis management. We had these massive industrial-strength fans strategically positioned just out of the camera's view, revealed the show's assistant director Gary Mitchell. The second we cut to commercial, we would blast those powerful fans directly at Welles to try and dry him out before the next segment started. At the same time, makeup artists would swarm in with industrial products meant for extreme perspiration control. It was honestly like watching a NASCAR pit crew servicing a human being. The disturbing reality that the home audience never witnessed was the rapid, progressive deterioration of Welles's hygiene throughout his interview blocks. While he usually walked out relatively dry and well put together, by the 15-minute mark of any interview his physical condition had typically gone completely downhill. His expensive custom-made shirts, despite being constructed from highly absorbent fabrics, would eventually become so saturated that they visibly changed texture right there on camera. Carson's subtle reactions to this unfolding disaster revealed both his consummate professionalism and his deep private horror. The sensitive desk microphones occasionally caught the host subtly sniffing the air after Welles made expansive gestures and involuntary reflex to the wave of strong odor that accompanied every movement. Leaked production notes from several of Welles's guest spots even included the cryptic instruction, "JC needs extra physical space for OW segment." The most infamous incident of all took place during a sweltering summer broadcast in 1975, when the studio's air conditioning system failed right in the middle of Welles's appearance. In mere moments, the legendary director was practically melting under the studio lights. The perspiration didn't just drip, it poured, mapping out vast wet territories across his expensive suit that a camera operator later compared to shifting tectonic plates. It got so intense that when they cut to commercial, the audience saw something rare: Johnny actually dragging his desk chair several inches to the right. He broke his perfect blocking just to escape the blast zone, signaling a true sensory crisis on stage that the cameras couldn't fully capture. Once the segment finally wrapped, it took 2 burly production assistants to hoist the heavyweight genius out of his seat. The aftermath was catastrophic. The guest chair was so thoroughly waterlogged that it had to be hauled off the set immediately like a biohazard. A janitor spilled the beans years later, revealing the grim reality they couldn't just steam clean that upholstery. The entire cushion had to be thrown out and replaced because the moisture damage was simply too deep to fix. Here's the kicker, though. Despite the damp upholstery and the heavy air, Johnny never banned him. He revered the filmmaker's brilliance enough to tolerate the mess. Johnny reportedly told a producer backstage, "Look, some talent is worth suffering for, and Orson is at the top of that list." However, he did add a caveat, begging for industrial fans next time. But if Welles was a flood, the next guest was a toxic cloud. We are talking about the walking chemical warfare that was Truman Capote. The tragic downfall of the literary darling played out right there on national television, documenting his slide from a brilliant young author to a train wreck of a cultural icon. Back in the 60s, Truman was sharp-witty and the picture of impeccable style. Fast forward to the mid-70s, and he had morphed into a creature the NBC staffers terrifiedly nicknamed the Chemical Man. The audience at home saw a finished product, but backstage it was a crisis management operation just to get him to the curtain. The makeup team called it the Capote Challenge, trying to paint a face that looked like a war zone into something fit for broadcast television. One veteran makeup artist admitted his complexion had turned a haunting gray that defied foundation. His eyes were often swimming in blood, creating a look so alarming it scared the crew. Beyond the visuals, his personal cleanliness had tanked so hard that the crew had to invent new protocols just to suppress the funk. They initiated the full Capote protocol, a multi-layered construction project on his face. This involved industrial-grade concealer to plaster over broken veins and layers of heavy-duty powder to soak up the grease. But the most disturbing part of the ritual was the scent strategy. They had to drown him in fragrance to cover up what a PA described as the distinct sour rot of a man who had been marinating in vodka for 3 days straight. Johnny, who was obsessed with being perfectly groomed, had to sit next to this disaster, testing his professionalism. It pushed his poker face to the limit as he sat beside a guest who was clearly falling apart at the seams. One cruel crew member noted he looked less like a writer and more like something that had washed up on the beach after a storm. The camera guys actually named a move after him, the Capote Lean, noting how Johnny started the interview sitting upright. Mitchell Stevens, a veteran cameraman, watched as the dynamic shifted minute by minute. As the studio heat cooked up Truman's cocktail of smells, Carson would slowly slide away, inching his chair back. By the third segment, Carson would be practically falling off the edge of his desk trying to find fresh air. It was a slow drift that forced the cameraman to reframe the shot, so the widening gap didn't look ridiculous on TV. The staff's biggest nightmare, however, was the infamous cologne situation. Truman knew he wasn't fresh, so he tried to nuke the problem with gallons of high-end perfume, which only made things infinitely worse. Mixing expensive musk with stale body odor created a biological weapon in the studio. An audio tech claimed the smell was so thick and complex, it would make your eyes sting and water from 10 feet away. The low point hit in 1979 when he showed up looking like he had slept in his clothes for a week. Wardrobe panicked because they couldn't scrub off the crusty reminders of his last few meals stuck to his lapel. Even worse, he was just spraying fresh scent over stale sweat without showering in between applications. It created a geological layering of stench perfume on top decay underneath that was absolutely suffocating to anyone nearby. Linda Martinez, a production assistant on the floor, said she would never forget Johnny's reaction that night. As soon as they cut to commercial, he leaned over to Ed McMahon, dead serious. He whispered, "Ed, I think I am technically under chemical attack right now." He immediately summoned his assistant and demanded a fresh suit jacket, convinced that Truman's radioactive aroma had actually seeped into the fabric of his own clothes. The absolute nadir of this hygiene horror show occurred during one of Capote's final heartbreaking visits to the studio. Visibly trembling and drenched in sweat under the intense studio lights, Capote began to radiate a disturbing presence. It was what one crew member vividly described as a nauseating cocktail of sour, stale cologne mixed with evident physical sickness. The atmosphere became so unbearably toxic that Carson, breaking his flawless hosting etiquette, for the first time ever actually stood up in the middle of Capote's story, pretending he needed to demonstrate a point when he really just needed to escape the fumes. Immediately after that excruciating segment finally concluded, Johnny took drastic action behind the scenes. He demanded that the commercial break be extended by an extra 30 seconds, a secret revealed by assistant director Peter Coleman. Johnny utilized those precious few moments to literally sprint into the wings and gasp for fresh air before he could stomach returning to the desk. It was the only time I ever witnessed him fighting so hard to keep it together. Yet despite these olfactory assaults, Carson kept booking Capote, driven by a deep respect for his literary genius and their decades of shared history. However, following the most disastrous appearances, Carson instituted a strict new rule that the backstage staff quietly dubbed the Capote Recovery Protocol. This was a multi-step decontamination process that involved Carson completely changing his suit scrubbing down and using a specialized heavy-duty mouthwash, while the guest chair was physically hauled away for deep industrial cleaning before another human being could sit in it. Capote later admitted he looked like a complete wreck and felt exactly like one, but he wasn't the worst offender. No. Number 1, Charles Bukowski. This was a full-blown biohazard alert. If Johnny Carson was the gold standard of television elegance, Charles Bukowski was his dark opposite, representing a deliberate, aggressive rejection of every hygiene standard Carson held dear. The infamous poet and novelist, often hailed as the laureate of American lowlife, dragged the authentic stench of his Skid Row lifestyle right onto the set of The Tonight Show, creating what remains the most legendary hygiene catastrophe in the program's long history. But what made Bukowski's infamous 1975 appearance stand out wasn't just the typical trouble of dealing with a messy guest. It was the shocking revelation that his personal aroma was so potent, it actually triggered an obscure clause in the NBC technical staff's contract regarding hazardous working environments. When Bukowski first stumbled into the studio, the initial reaction from the crew was one of pure stunned disbelief, as remembered by talent coordinator Richard Peterson. It wasn't simply that he had neglected to prepare for a massive national television appearance. It appeared that he had actively worked to cultivate a state of biological distress that defied any conventional description of being dirty. The makeup artists, who were typically unflappable after decades of handling celebrities in various states of disarray, were shaken. They documented their encounter with brutal honesty in the official production notes, which read like a medical report. The report noted that the subject appeared to be coated in multiple layers of body odor, suggesting he had gone an extended period without bathing. His hair seemed to contain unidentified substances, and possibly even small insects, while his skin had a grimy film that actually repelled standard cleansing wipes. His breath was so foul that the notes suggested immediate medical intervention might be appropriate. The horrifying backstory was that Bukowski had apparently spent the 48 hours leading up to his Tonight Show appearance doing his own version of prep work. This involved a continuous drinking bender at the grimiest dive bars across Los Angeles. He arrived at the studio not merely unprepared, but in a state of active physical deterioration. The wardrobe department was so repulsed, they flat out refused to touch his jacket with their bare hands, according to assistant producer Michael Coleman. They resorted to using wooden hangers and tongs to manage his clothing, and the head of wardrobe threatened to file a formal union grievance if she was forced to make skin contact with his belongings. Carson's reaction the moment he first laid eyes on Bukowski created a piece of TV history. It created what staff still whisper about as the legendary moment, a split-second crack in the host's perfect professional armor that exposed the sheer horror beneath. As Bukowski shambled over for their pre-show greeting, Carson couldn't help himself. He visibly flinched and instinctively took a hard step backward before he managed to snap his composure back into place. Johnny's face cycled through about 5 different emotions in one single second, stage manager Thomas Wilson recalled. It went from horror to disgust, then panic resignation, and finally his professional mask clicked back on. It was like watching someone get hit with a stun gun and recover in real time. The interview itself became a masterclass in Carson's superhuman professionalism under fire. Stuck sitting next to what one camera operator described as a human petri dish, Carson maintained his polite, engaged demeanor while secretly using every defensive trick in the book. He leaned his chair back to the maximum possible distance while trying to appear casual. He angled his torso slightly away while keeping his face polite and turned toward Bukowski, employing a survival tactic. The staff called it the emergency breath technique, where he breathed almost exclusively through his mouth to minimize the olfactory assault. The disturbing reality behind the scenes was that Carson was experiencing genuine physical distress throughout the segment. During the very first commercial break, his longtime personal assistant sprinted to the host with a special handkerchief. It had been soaked in mentholated oil, an old theatrical trick actors use when they have to perform in scenes with overpowering stenches. Johnny was legitimately nauseated, confirmed production assistant William Turner. I could see him swallowing hard repeatedly during Bukowski's responses, which is the universal sign of someone fighting the urge to vomit. Yet on camera, he looked totally at ease. Looking back, it stands out as one of the most unforgettable spectacles ever captured on live television. Things spiraled into a full-blown emergency during the second block as the hot studio lights baked down on Bukowski, eventually triggering what one traumatized sound engineer described as a total olfactory nightmare. The stench grew so overwhelmingly thick in the air that a specific camera, operator stationed right next to the hot seat, actually had to be swapped out mid-taping because the production notes claim his eyes were watering so badly he couldn't see through the lens. However, the truly jaw-dropping detail regarding that night didn't surface until many years. Down the line, when Johnny Carson's own private doctor spilled the beans that the legendary host needed urgent medical care the moment the segment wrapped. Poor Johnny was struck with a migraine so debilitating he required prescription-grade relief, a fact that Dr. Samuel Richards finally brought to light during a candid interview back in 2010. Richards said Carson dialed him from the dressing room, instantly begging for something heavier than his standard script, claiming his condition was a direct physical reaction to the sensory assault he endured on stage. But here's the twist that makes this entire saga so wild, even after surviving. Such a physically punishing ordeal, Carson later confessed to his producer that Bukowski was still one of the most fascinating figures he ever interviewed. "Sometimes true genius just doesn't smell very sweet," he reportedly quipped. "I guess that is simply the cost of raw authenticity." Meanwhile, the seat Bukowski occupied sparked a backstage war the crew called the Great Cleaning Debate, with half the staff demanding a deep industrial scrub and the rest insisting it be destroyed. If you believe the whispers from multiple insiders present that day, the hardliners won out. That chair was permanently hauled off the soundstage and never saw the light of day again. It marks the single instance in the program's decades-long run where a prop had to be retired forever strictly because of a celebrity guest's hygiene issues.